scientists. How do other scientists test the hypothesis, test the validity of the hypothesis by means of an experiment or experiments? These experiments are called controlled experiments. So what's controlled experiment? Controlled experiment is an experiment that involves manipulation of only one variable while fixing the others. The examiner should, let's say, should keep all factors constant except for one. The person, let's say, must change only one factor, right? So let's go to the definition of controlled experiment. Control experiment is the experiment that involving manipulation of single variable, of one variable or factor while fixing the others. And by the way, I want to explain the these numbers. These numbers are complement of the previous lectures. In previous lectures, let's say I wrote 10 questions. Right now, it starts from 11. Question number 11, what are the variables which studied by Galilei in his experiment? What are the factors? The factors were what? The factors were weight, height, size, time, air resistance, and shape. They are all the factors that Galilei, let's say, focused on, right? What were Galilei's problem? But before I go to the Galilei's problem, and I explained it in advance for you in previous lecture, I explained the problems of Galilei. I told you the first one, the lack of accurate clock at that time, the lack of, let's say, accurate measuring device. There was not, let's say, accurate measuring device at that time. I told you clocks were pendulum clocks, where they were not accurate. That's why Galilei couldn't measure the exact time for for example, phenomena. The second problem of Galilei, there was no way to eliminate a resistance. I explained that in advance. There was no way to eliminate a resistance. I told you we need the vacuum chamber in order to test the, for example, velocity of falling objects. In reality, I told you in reality, maybe you say Aristotle is right in reality, because we are surrounded by air. But whenever you evacuate the air, right, whenever you evacuate the air resistance, in the absence of air resistance, all the objects, regardless of their masses, fall with the same time at the same rate, right? And this is a summary of the previous lecture. Actually, let me focus on, let's say, control experiment. For example, Galilei wanted to study these factors, but excuse me, but the examiner should test the hypothesis, should test the, let's say, experiment or hypothesis one by one, right? Should test these factors, excuse me, examiner should test these factors one by one. Let me explain this one. Galilei wanted to test the size of the falling objects, right? Let me try a situation for you. The person should bring what? The person should bring the two balls with different sizes, but with the same mass, 1 kilogram, 1 kilogram. They have to fall with at the same height. The height is constant. The height is fixed for either. And the time of, let's say, falling is the same. So all of the factors are fixed except for one, except for size. So this experiment focuses on size. That's why the person, let's say, examines only size, right? Let me draw another control experiment for you. and I wanted to guess the factor. Which factor does the let's say does the control experiment focus on? Let me draw it for you. Right? This is another experiment. I wanted to guess the factor. Which factor does the control experiment, let's say, study? They have the same size. They are, let's say, 1 kilogram. They have the same mass, identical mass, right? So I'm sure you know the answer. Here, let's say, height is changed. That's why this experiment focuses on height. Height is changed. Here, size is changed. That's why only one factor is manipulated. Only one factor is changed. Let's say other factors should be fixed. And this is about let's say a controlled experiment, right? About another question, what was Galileo's solution to overcome his problem? I told you about the problems of Galilei. There was no less accurate device for measuring time at that time. There was no way to eliminate air resistance. So how did Galilei overcome this problem? How did Galilei solve this problem? By using, let's say, inclined planes, by using ramps like this. Yeah, this is an inclined plane like this. So what was Galilei's solution to overcome his problems? He used ramps or inclined planes in his experiment. And the steeper the ramp is, the more the model is close to the reality. Let me draw an inclined plane for you. For example, this is an inclined plane, right? He used a ramp. Which one is more, let's say, convenient for studying natural phenomena? Of course, this one is more convenient. The steeper the ramp is, let's say, the more the model is closer to the reality. This is about the inclined plane. And by using of, let's say, inclined plane or ramps, Galilei could solve or overcome his problem. Right? Let's go to the other question, or we have a tip here. If the expectations, for example, Galilei did his expectation, or let me explain, let me tell you another, aside from Galilei's experiment. Galilei was let's say, theorist, right? He proposed the hypothesis. He said something about falling objects. But I told you in 1971, David Scott examined this this idea by falling down two different objects, by falling down a hammer and feather on the surface of moon, and they struck the surface, the lunar surface at the same time, simultaneously, and this was the first confirmation of Galilei's hypothesis. In this situation, the results of their experiment coincide with what? Coincide with the expectation of the hypothesis, right? Whenever David Scott observed that the feather and hammer fell down, let's say, and at the same rate, and they reached the lunar surface simultaneously, he realized that Galilei was right. So the result of expectation is corresponded to what? Is corresponded to the expectation of hypothesis. That's why in this situation, hypothesis, let's say, turns to theory, right? So hypothesis turns to a theory, which is called, and I can name the theory as verified hypothesis. Theory means verified hypothesis. If the hypothesis passes the test, right, passes the controlled experiment, after that, it automatically turns to the theory, which is a verified hypothesis, right? if the expectations within the hypothesis correspond to the experimental data or experimental result, then the hypothesis being confirmed and becomes a theory. I told you, I explained it for you. According to scientific method, any hypothesis, according to the scientific method, any hypothesis must be tested in a controlled experiment. I explained it for you in advance. When is, question number 4, when is theory considered correct and accepted for, let's say, for publication? When is theory considered correct and accepted for publication? When the, let's say, when it expect and interpret the results of the experiment. When the theory, or let's say, expect what? When it predicts the let's say results of the experiment. And in other words, when the experimental data coincide with let's say expectation of the hypothesis. What is theory? Let me write this one for you. I say experimental data, or experimental data. When experimental data coincide with what? Coincide with the prediction of the hypothesis. Prediction of hypothesis. What happens in this situation? So hypothesis becomes what? Hypothesis becomes theory. It becomes a theory, right? When this condition is satisfied, hypothesis becomes a theory. Hypothesis is no longer hypothesis, it turns to the theory, which is ready to publish, actually. Right now, what is theory? Let me explain it for you. It's the verified hypothesis by experiment, right? Number 16, what happens if the results of an experiment do not support? Look here. There's a, for example, failed hypothesis. Maybe some hypotheses don't pass the test, actually. They don't move to the theory. They don't become a theory. So in this situation, what happens to the hypothesis? What happens if the results of an experiment do not support the hypothesis? When the condition is not satisfied, when experimental data opposes the, for example, expectation of hypothesis, in this situation, what's the solution? What shall the theories do, right? It said the hypothesis must be abandoned or revised or amended. So the hypothesis must be abandoned, must be left, right? Must be, let's say, left forever, or it must be amended, right? You can change, the theorist could, let's say, could change some parts of the hypothesis to correct his, for example, mistakes, right? His or her mistakes. So either the hypothesis is, let's say, left, or let's say, or amended. Either you lift it, you leave it, actually, and it doesn't work for any situation, or you change some parts of the hypothesis, which is called, let's say, amend. So either by abandoning or let's say amending the hypothesis. Building hypothesis is the basis. Look here. I didn't explain this one on purpose. I want to explain it on a, let's say, this map, on this graph. That's why I didn't say basis. So among the 4 steps of, let's say, scientific method, the second step and the 4th step are more important than the others. The second one is the testing, is the making hypothesis. The second one, making hypothesis. which is a base of the scientific method. Base. This is the basis. This is the foundation of the scientific method. So hypothesis is the foundation or basis of hypothesis, the foundation of scientific method. But theory, establishing a theory, right, is the most important part of the scientific method. I can say it's the paramount part of the scientific method. Let's say I want to explain on a graph for you, but before I explain this one, we have a, let's say, note here. Building hypothesis is the basis of scientific method, and establishing theory is the most important part of it, right? And by the way, before I go to the graph, I want to explain something. I want to add something that which is not in our, let's say, textbook. I'm gonna talking about the a speech of Einstein. Einstein says that the good theory is a theory that whenever you explain it for your grandmother, your grandmother, let's say, understands it immediately. This is a good theory. Einstein says that the theory should be very simple. So simplicity is the main, let's say, condition for a theory. There are some theories, actually, they are confirmed. They are, let's say, they pass the controlled experiment. They become a theory, right? But they are complicated. They are complicated, and they are not, let's say, they are not useful. They are not easy for, let's say, for understanding. That's why they are not good. Aside from that, actually, there are some, let's say, hypotheses. Some hypotheses, even as Wolfgang Pauli is the winner of Nobel Prize of Physics, said, bad theories are, let's say, he has a, let's say, very nice speech about the bad theories. He says that they are not even wrong. It's very nice speech, actually. They are not, bad theories are not even wrong. They are not even wrong. They are pointless. They are, let's say, meaningless. That's why, let's say, I can say they failed at the first, for example, at the first test, they don't pass the controlled experiment, right? Let's move on to the scientific method. We have a scientific method plan. This scientific method plan, let's say, I can say this graph summarizes all steps of the scientific method. It summarizes the whole topic for us. Let me explain for you. The first one, observation and asking questions. It talks about, that's observation, collecting data, observation, the first step. The second step, making hypothesis after you observe the phenomena. Let's say after you collect information, after that you make a hypothesis. So you formulate or make a hypothesis. After that, and I told you, let me write it for you here. This is the basis of what making hypothesis is the making hypothesis is the basis, right? Basis of the scientific method. The third, let's say, step, test your hypothesis. Testing hypothesis is the third one, right? After testing hypothesis, let's say the person analyze the data, analyze the experimental data. So we have control experiment here. After, let's say, of course, testing hypothesis or analyzing data is the same, right? All of these, let's say, actions are taking place within this step, testing hypothesis. Deduce the result. After that, they make some, for example, some experiment in laboratory. They analyze data, they deduce the result, and they, of course, they deduce the results. Here, after that, look here. It's very nice part of the. If the, let's say, results of the experiment, look here. Look, the, let's say, the orange arrow, right? If the experimental data, look here, do not support the hypothesis, right? Within the laboratory, the results don't coincide the hypothesis. They don't support the hypothesis. The results don't support the hypothesis. What happens? The person should reconsider it, the hypothesis, or reject it, right? In this situation, either the hypothesis is rejected completely, or maybe it's revised by a scientist itself, himself or herself, by a theorist himself or herself, right? After that, look here. Whenever he or she didn't pass the, or hypothesis, let's say, whenever the hypothesis didn't, let's say, coincide with the experimental data, automatically it returns to what? It returns to the basis. It returns to the formulating the hypothesis. So the hypothesis should be let's say, amended. Yeah, should be amended. But we have other probability. We have another probability. Maybe the results of the experiment support the expectation of hypothesis. In this situation, I drew it with a green arrow. So in this situation, results support the hypothesis. Result of the experiment support the hypothesis. In this situation, the hypothesis becomes the theory, right? It's ready to publish the results so that the other scientists may check it by carrying more experiments. Actually, after the hypothesis passes the, let's say, control experiment, it returns to, let's say, it becomes a theory. So the theory right now is valid. Hypothesis turns to theory, and it's no longer hypothesis in this situation. So it says in this situation, in let's say in this part, we have other probability. It says if the results not supported by scientists, right? Maybe let's say one experiment support the data, but they do a lot of experiments. You see, it says it may check. Scientists may check it by carrying more experiments. Maybe one experiment, let's say, coincides the expectation of hypothesis, but it's not enough. Other scientists actually, let's say, other experiments are needed. Actually, scientists do more experiments, right? If the result, for example, if majority of the experimental data doesn't support the hypothesis, what happens to the hypothesis? Here, results not supported by scientists, it returns to the hypothesis itself. So hypothesis has a problem here. That's why we say it's the basis of the scientific method. Any problem with the, let's say, with the hypothesis, any problem with the process, excuse me, any problem with the process is related to the, let's say, basis of the scientific method. It's related to the, let's say, hypothesis. Hypothesis should be, let's say, should be reformed. But if the results of the experiment, let's say, support the hypothesis, in this situation, I can say a theory becomes, let's say, valid, and theory is born. Let's say theory is born.